Hello, and welcome on my little essay on Silas from Da Vinci Code, a book that came out 22 years ago. So, does anybody even remember him? I don't know. I do. I don't know. I have to preface this video by telling you that my English is actually pretty awful, as you can hear. I have a horrible accent and my voice is not helping either. So I'm so sorry. If you don't like listening to it, you can read it actually, because I wrote and published it on... I have no idea. You can read it all on the link in description, because I wrote it entirely, and I will just read it because if I start thinking about what I'm gonna say, it will be wrong. I just can't help it. That's how it is when English is your third or fourth language at this point. I don't even care anymore. So as for this video, I will simply read my text. I hope I won't make it too robotic or cringe. It is very embarrassing because I wrote it and because it's my favorite character, and obviously I'm very biased, so you will hear that in the text. And I don't know, I will pretend I don't exist, so just listen to the essay. Bon appétit! Since I recently started working on one and now two different fanfics where Silas appears, I figured that it would be a good idea to dissect that poor man to make sure that I won't feel like I gravely mischaracterized him in a few months after rereading my stories. You don't need to care about said stories. However, you are required to have read the book The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, of course, as I'm writing this essay assuming that you already know the source material. Yeah, I guess that you don't have to have read it, but if you didn't, it will be very confusing. But if you're listening to this and you're kind of intrigued, then I hope that it will convince you to read the book, because the book is nice. So read it. So I want to precise that despite the movie following the book very well, they changed Silas and Aaron Garros as characters quite a bit, so they didn't have really the time in the scenario to start building up their characters, so there's not much to say about them in the movie. What I mean is that in this essay I will pretend that the movie doesn't exist. So if you have watched the movie, well, at least you can follow the story, but yeah, it won't be the same. For the little details, the book came out in 2003, so the story should revolve around that time, more or less. It said that it takes place 1 year after Angels and Demons, that came out in 2000, so maybe 2001, maybe earlier, since technically when you write a book it takes some time, so the author certainly had another year in his head while writing, but it's somewhere around there, I suppose. Maybe it's not, and I don't know. I have no idea. So the thing is that around the time I was, 7 in 2003? Was I? 8? I have no idea. I'm bad at math. But I don't remember much about that era, right? There is 9/11. But the world was much more uncivilized on some aspects, so, especially when Silas would have been a kid, especially in France, I'm sorry, but I lived in Belgium for 20 years, and I can tell you that there is a lot of horrific stories involving children, very sadly, of course. I sound like that because I'm very embarrassed talking out loud. It's not because I'm not touched by children. What am I talking about? Forget about that. What I'm trying to say is that the lack of involvement from the authorities towards poor and orphan children, the people being disagreeable and quite mean in general. So, even if Silas' backstory feels kind of aggressively cruel, it's not beyond realism for the time, for the place, and especially back then, because even normal people in early 2000, they had like very high beauty standards, and people were not ashamed to show their disgust towards someone. So, even nowadays, I mean, a lot of people would look at someone different like that, not very nicely. Okay, I'm not reading anymore. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm sure that you can't even follow me anymore. But what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the time, even now, children who have no relationships outside of their abusive parents and have no contact with like school system or anything like that, they're often just left to their demise, and people don't seem to care as much as we hope they would, right? So, I mean, if you know the story, you know what happens to him, and when you read it, it feels like it's, oh, that wouldn't happen, right? But I mean, it is happening all the time. It's just that people don't want to see these kind of things because it's very painful to feel like something like that could happen to like children and anyone. I mean, adults too, of course. And for a matter of convenience, I will call Silas from the start, because, well, you certainly know that it's not his real name, but we don't know his real name, I think. Well, it's not written in the book, so I will go with that. So this is the first part of the essay. I haven't really totally finished it because I really want to be rambling about a lot of the details, and I will keep this part more focused on summarizing his life and analyzing more or less what is happening without going too much into the details. So even if it takes me like half a year to finish the second one, at least you will have the time to think about, I mean, him as a story and not having my opinion about everything clouding your mind or something. So I spoke for long enough. I will start my thing. So I will try to not deviate too much from the text now, because I think I rambled a bit outside of what I wrote already, and I'm not even sure it's grammatically correct. I have no idea. Maybe you can't understand me because, my accent. I know I already spoke about that. I will calm down. Here, I will put like a timestamp or something. You can skip all these and listen to the thing and be at peace. Surprisingly, we are given a lot of information about Silas and his past. He is an important character in the book, more so than Remy, for example, but still the amount of details we get about each of his actions, thoughts and past is far greater than most of the rest of the cast, right? And amongst those detailed explanations in the chapter, we get to read a great deal about his life from early childhood to pretty much the start of the book. And the book obviously speaks about, well, the rest of his life because, spoiler, he dies at the end. Oh, okay. Sorry. The book presents his past life in a very factual way, with only a few words from Silas himself on those memories. Obviously, what we get is no more than what he remembers. There is no outside perspective on what he went through, but those scenes also make it very clear that there is no outside perspective because there was never someone to give any sort of context to Silas' life in the first place. Not to get ahead of my chronological dissection, but it's an important part of Silas' blind loyalty to the only people who ever gave him the feeling that his life matters. Silas was born in Marseille, France, and just like him, we don't know the name his parents gave him. I mean, he knew it back then, but not anymore, and we don't either. He started his life witnessing constant abuse of his mother by his alcoholic father. From what he assumes, she was mistreated solely due to Silas' albinism, an assumption we can only accept as, like him, the only thing we learn of his father's hatred is that it was born with his son and his condition, something he seems to state directly, calling him an embarrassment and a disaster. Perhaps the father believed Silas to be the son of a stranger, as he doesn't share his peculiar characteristics, but albinism can be present in one's genes without it being perceptible by sight alone. All you need is two parents who have a dormant albino gene passed down from their ancestors for their child to have a chance of displaying albino traits. Of course, if no one in the direct family is visibly albino, it could be hard to believe, and maybe it is true when Silas was born from an affair, but regardless of the reasoning or even the reality of the situation, what Silas perceived as a little child was that his existence was a burden to his parents, a feeling that never really left him. Silas recalls his father's words multiple times during the present events, words that shaped him until the end. One of them being spectre, a concept he couldn't help but associate to himself as spectre, a ghost, repeating it even as he's dying. But words are not the most traumatic experience he endured under his father's ruling. Not only would he witness repeated violence against his own mother, but he was himself brutalized when he would try to intervene. The father was described as a burly dog walker, and he certainly was not holding back his drunken attacks. Silas was only 7 when the worst of it happened. One evening, after once again seeing his mother being punished for his existence, she simply never got back up. Despite his young age, he understood perfectly what happened, why and how. Silas obviously blamed himself, thinking, "This is my fault." He always tried to protect her, but he failed her. We don't know what the mother thought of him. The lack of characterization might be perceived as a sign of neglect, or perhaps Silas was unable to endure the most painful memories enough to really be able to remember her, and simply kept them repressed to alleviate his pain and guilt. But her death awakened rage and despair inside of him. The father never lived to be judged for his crimes. That same night, after falling asleep, Silas was there, still awake, in the same home as his dead mother and her murderer. Described as controlled by a demon, he grabbed a knife and stabbed his sleeping father, who, even when awakened by the attack, was too drunk and shocked to defend himself. Silas didn't stab him once, he stabbed him again and again and again until the man was silent, having nothing left and feeling responsible for everything that happened that night. Silas saw no other choice but to run away. It is hard to believe that a 7-year-old kid would survive on his own, and that he would have been allowed to live on the street by the adults who would have obviously seen his misery. But it seems that he either hid it too well, or once again nobody cared. There is no mention of any institution trying to help the young boy. There is no mention of anyone. When later on Aringarosa takes him in, it is said that it's been a long time since Silas has been shown kindness, implying that he at least for sure was helped here and there in the past. It's also explained that people used to see him with pity until he started growing up, certainly suggesting that despite being on his own, he might have received food, clothes, and maybe some kind of refuge for the war seasons. Though it's never explicitly stated, it would help the believability of the scenario. I mean, a lot of kids actually do grow in the streets. They are resilient and can survive with disgusting food and sleeping on the ground when not raised to expect more, but they usually have at least some kind of guardian. Children often don't survive very long after disappearing, even when they learn basic survival tips beforehand. Because they just don't understand what makes you sick, how to survive the sickness, what do you do when bleeding, what kind of people or animals they should avoid. On their own, they basically have to rely on luck to survive. Silas doesn't seem to have had anyone to teach him about survival, but if in pure speculation we consider that both of his parents have been neglectful from the start, if we imagine that Silas doesn't recall a single positive word from his mother because she actually never said any and was only passively trying to keep him alive while leaving him mostly on his own, Silas would have learned to rely on himself and would have shown more maturity than other kids his age. What you can also notice right away is that no one was looking for him. You'd think that a lost albino child would be easy to spot even in a big city, but even when confronted by the police, no one seemed to be interested in his fate. No distant family trying to find him, no one from the school system reporting him as missing after his parents' death, as if he never existed. It is not obligatory in France to send your kids to school from age 3 to 16. He was obviously 7 after he ran away. Maybe back in the 1960s or whenever he was born it wasn't the case, but whoever the parents did it legally or not, it wouldn't be out of the question that Silas was never schooled and that it is how he ended up lost to the system, having no one left to remember him. Cases of mistreated kids who are kept at home and are never brought to the doctor in fear that the abuse will be discovered happen more often than one might think, and knowing that his father's abuse was enough to kill an adult woman, there is no doubt that Silas will display marks that they will try to hide at all cost. So from his escape to his 12th birthday, Silas is said to settle in the basement of an abandoned factory. He had to survive on his own as he was rejected by other unfortunate kids living in the same condition. He was mostly stealing from the docks and dumpster diving to survive, having no social connection at all. He had to rely on old magazines found among the trash for comfort. It's also said that this is how he taught himself to read. And that could be another proof of him being kept out of the school system, as typically kids start to learn reading before the age of 7. But the fact that he learned to read by himself shows not only that he has reasonably good logical abilities, but also that despite everything that happened until now, he was not only driven by instinct and survival, but also by the longing for something more. As the time passed, he grew stronger than the average 12-year-old boy, and that might have led him to be perceived as being older than he was by strangers, driving the little help he received away. One day, a homeless woman said to be twice his age would harass him on the street, mocking him and trying to steal his food, and Silas answered by beating her severely, enough for the police to intervene. Silas does call his past violent and his skills serviceable for the murders he was tasked to commit later on. We could take it as him simply recalling the 3 incidents where he directly harmed someone, but it could also imply that he had to be violent to survive in general. He could have fought a lot, but only the cases where his violence went too far were mentioned. But instead of wondering why a 12-year-old kid is homeless, alone on the street, and confronted by a grown adult, the police threaten him with juvenile prison if he doesn't leave the city. Certainly, Silas wasn't able or didn't try to advocate for himself, and the police didn't try to sympathize with him, as they would only see him as a problem. We could assume that Silas was certainly reported by the past for theft or simply known for his disturbing appearance, so without further inquiry from his birthplace, Silas moved to live on the streets of Toulon, another French coastal city. A small detail I wanted to bring up is that his moving between Marseille and Toulon is not at all explained. He was said to have lived mostly in coastal cities, walking from one to another and simply finding himself in Toulon over time, but looking on Google, the space between the two cities is mostly overgrown by a wild and cliff-like area with very little ways to easily go from one to the other following the sea. So he would have walked around it, certainly knowing where to go. Maybe he could have found a way to be I have no idea how to say that. Driven, you understand, to the other side of the wilderness. That whole territory being quite huge, with possibly only a few small inhabited places in the lot where he would have been too noticed to find what he'd need to survive without donations, I think that him taking the long road around it would make more sense. I don't know, I was just checking out in Street View and I felt the need to say it. Okay. As Silas grew more imposing and strong, passers-by started to fear him and avoid him altogether. He would notice people's stares and hear their comments. They would call him a ghost, following the sentiment of his late father, pointing out his muted presence, his pale body and demonic-like red eyes. Having nothing else to characterize him, he accepted this identity, seeing himself only as an immaterial entity haunting ports, only visible to a few people who would look at him in fear. He had nothing else to aspire to. He spent his developing years with no attachment to anything, not a person, not a place, not even himself. Another minor detail I couldn't help but bring up is that as an albino living in very sunny coastal cities with no way to get any skin protection, he must have had multiple burns or other skin problems typically associated with albinism that leaves one with no defense against deadly sun rays. And not only the skin, albinism often facilitates sight-related issues, as yet again there is no melanin to protect one from that stupid deadly fireball, but he seems to have turned it out fine on that issue since he's not wearing glasses, and certainly Aringarosa would have provided him with them if he had any difficulty. He might as well have gotten used to come out at night only, for that reason and to avoid passers-by, but judging from his nomadic lifestyle, it's hard to imagine he could have avoided the sun issue altogether. And of course, there is no way to believe that he could have stayed away from common sickness, that he would have had to wait off by himself, and especially anything he could have caught eating discarded food and raw fish stolen from the docks, as he was said to do. When he turned 18, his past finally caught up to him as two deck workers found him stealing from their cargo and decided to beat him up to teach him a lesson. They were drunk and it immediately sent Silas back to the memories of his father and made him lose control, and unfortunately for him, being now way taller and stronger than the average guy, he could easily inflict a lot of damage. While fighting his two attackers, he barehandedly killed the first one and would have killed the second if the police didn't show up. Personally, I think that one disheveled, homeless young man attacking back two drunk dock workers beating him up, and who certainly would also have been considered as strong, barehandedly in a temporary loss of control provoked by PTSD and cruel taunting should have been enough of attenuating circumstances for him to avoid too much of a lengthy sentence. I understand that a man died, but considering the cases I heard of from Belgium, cases that never caught attention of the press, I know for a fact that some young troubled adults who are accused of killing a fellow man in a provoked brawl can often get short sentences followed by community work and a probation period. I suppose that it wasn't considered as self-defense since they attacked Silas for stealing, although beating up a thief 2 against 1 is hardly an appropriate response. It could still be seen as Silas provoking the fight. And besides, Silas could maybe not have expressed why he did what he did. not knowing anything about PTSD or even lawyers? He might just have said, yes, I did it, and nobody cared to know why. Regardless of the reasons, the judge showed no mercy, and Silas was sentenced for a period of minimum 10 years in prison. It's the amount of time he did spend in it. It says over 10 years, but that might have been counting months or something. We're not told how long exactly the sentencing was set to, but at no point did Silas express any anticipation for a possible freedom, possibly indicating that he might have got himself a life sentence or a period so long that he didn't see himself surviving it. It's clear that they saw Silas as a nuisance that they didn't want to keep roaming the streets and not as a citizen who was rehabilitating. And to get rid of him for good, they sent him to Andorra to serve his sentence, far from everything he ever knew. Andorra is kind of its own country, more specifically called a sovereign landlocked country. Who knows why Silas was sent there of all places? Personally, I'm not sure that you can be sent to serve a prison sentence in a country that has nothing to do with where you committed the crime or where you're from. There could be a lot of nuance since Andorra is in some sort of ally-ship with France, or maybe something about the European Union, but I don't see myself researching the topic as it's not really important to the analysis. This place sucks, it's all I need to know. Silas was moved from a hot environment bordering the Mediterranean Sea to a cold alpine territory where only a fraction of people speak the same language as he did. And just like this, Silas was cut from the few things he had ever known. For the next 10 years, he would sit in a stone-cold cell with no window to the outside world. I just know that he hadn't seen the moon this whole time, so maybe there was a window and the moon just never passed through it, but yeah, it kind of feels like there was not. From one scene that describes him as sleeping on the floor, it might imply that he also didn't have a bed to sleep on. To me, it all sounds like some kind of human rights violation. I don't doubt that, especially back then, even prisons from Central Europe might do shady stuff that nobody can really check on to cut costs or because their workers simply know to be able to get away with all this, especially if most of their convicts are serving life sentences and have no family to complain to. The place is described as smelling death, amongst other terrible things. But that implies that there would be enough inmates dying in that prison for the smell being still present long enough to be an important characteristic of the place over a decade in it. Silas was brought to his cell naked, as other inmates would mock and humiliate him. It's unclear if he ever got any accommodation or clothes or anything following his arrival, but from the description we got of that period, it seems that he had pretty much nothing at all. Living in those conditions, they humanized Silas even further, slowly erasing his sense of self, forgetting even his own name. He didn't even have any good memories to shield himself into. It's said that he knew then that he was not transparent, not truly a ghost. Later in the story, he reflects on the fact that taking vows of celibacy was a welcomed commitment as he endured sexual abuse in that prison, described as horrors he went through. Between all this and the stench, the cries from other prisoners, the cold, no matter what had ever happened to him before or after this time in Andorra is for him the worst of it all and something he could never escape. The memories of his detention would torment him until the end, and he consciously had to fight to repress them, even during the mission he saw as the most important moment of his life. We can see him taken aback by the mere sight of the stone church, unable to stop himself from reliving everything that happened to him, repeating to himself the insults he heard there, recalling even those told to him in Spanish, a language he admitted not understanding when he first spoke to Aringarosa. Silas lived in that hell from 18 to more or less 30, shaping his already lost and broken mind into something completely hollow, void of anything. He didn't believe in heaven, but even then it is said that the only thing he was still waiting for was to die. One night, an earthquake shook the prison enough for a few old walls to crumble down and let a few prisoners escape, Silas being one of them. At that moment, he certainly didn't have much time to reflect on the event, but later on, he saw his escape as one of the events from a chain fated by God himself, a sign for him that he could be something more than just a ghost. Finally, out of this hell, Silas took his chances and ran until he couldn't anymore. Fatigued and hungry, he started losing consciousness as he walked on train tracks until reaching an empty freight car, falling asleep inside. In his sleep, the train started moving, driving him away from Andorra towards Spain. With no goal in mind and hardly able to stay awake, he would have let the train take him wherever if it wasn't for a worker who discovered him in the wagon and threw him out of it. Silas then managed to walk to a town. Oviedo is not a town, it's like a big city, but it has some more isolated spaces around it, I guess. I feel like I remember it was saying something about it being a small town or something. I was like, that's not a small town, but maybe I didn't read it well because I tried to find it, but I couldn't, so it's all in my head. Who cares? Okay, I'm sorry. He was bleeding and starved and unable to find any food and even walk any longer. He laid down in a ditch, dying slowly. It's at that hopeless moment that someone found him and dropped him off to a local priest, Manuel Aringarosa. A little odd that they would do this instead of calling the police or an ambulance when they find a bloody, naked, dying man on the road, but they at least did something. I was told that it might have been a common practice to help people suspected of either having no money for medical bills or could have been wanted by the authorities, but in this case, I would have believed that someone kidnapped him and ditched his body once it expired. Regardless, I have no idea what I would do in that situation, so I can't really comment on other people's decisions. Still delirious, Silas woke up to a vision. Jesus was talking to him, telling him that he was saved. It implied that it was a cross hanging in his room that induced this feeling, an image he saw as welcoming as he laid in a soft, clean bed for the first time in forever. Even once the vision stopped, Silas associated the cross with comfort, feeling safe, surrounded by the smell of candles and warm food waiting for him beside his bed. For a few days he would only barely wake up to eat and fall back asleep between exhaustions and the desire to stay in this nice dream a little longer. He finally regained consciousness to a scream and the sound of a fight. Silas immediately ran toward it and without thinking threw the intruder of the frail man with a freshly broken nose. As the thief ran away, Silas brought the priest to a couch. Even knowing nothing of who the man was and where they were, Silas didn't hesitate to come to his aid. It is said that he didn't know why he did it, but it might have been a mix between his distant memories of protecting the weak against the aggressor, and perhaps pushed by the desire to have experienced it himself, that someone would have been there to save him when he needed it. Even after learning nothing but cruelty and injustice, Silas seems to still have a softer side, certainly something that Aringarosa noticed as well. Something I personally find very charming, wonderful. I'm not sure what kind of word I'm supposed to use there, so I'm sorry. Look, I'm very embarrassed right now, so I will make it short. It's very cute, okay, voilà. That after a lifetime of isolation, no conditioning to act serviceable, only having himself to think about for his best interests, all the hatred he received, the injustice, the pain, the cruelty, he still truly wants to be good, to be loved, to help people, to believe in something bigger than himself. Maybe I read too much into it, but I just love him so much. What can I say? My soul is swayed by his. Okay. The priest noticed Silas speaking French in his sleep and did his best to communicate with the strange man. After exchanging a few words, seeing that he wouldn't give his name and had no idea where he was, Aringarosa understood very quickly that he was one of the dangerous criminals who escaped from that prison in Andorra. But instead of shaming him for it, the priest stopped him from running away and offered him a place to stay. Manuel Aringarosa only recently established himself in Oviedo with the project of building a church, and he saw in the lost man someone who could be saved by God, someone who could help him with his dream of a glorious holy destiny. So this is my personal opinion, but in the complete opposite of Silas, who actually did kill several people, and it is very bad. I'm not saying it's not bad, okay, just listen. I don't have the same nice and pure vibe from Aringarosa, who actually display many good people qualities and seems averse to violence. Even when his life was destroyed by a vile person, he refused to even consider revenge. Still, his soul seems arrogant, selfish, something feels wrong, even outside of his power hunger problems. So it's a little funny that a broken, violent man who follows a generous and good church leader is more gracious in his nature than the goody two-shoes leader himself. And it's that fucking nice guy who leads him into corrupting himself again, so I have biases, okay? I said that I will try to not. Did I say that? I don't know. But I have biases. Silas is cute. Aringarosa, stupid. Aringarosa presented Silas with a French copy of the Bible, marked on a page talking about a prisoner called Silas who was freed from his jail cell by God. The man without a name for the first time saw an identity, someone he could be. And so Silas was reborn. The priest told him of fate, and Silas carefully constructed his life around it. Everything he endured was worth it because he was called for something greater. As Silas learned to repress his feelings and past to conform to Aringarosa's teachings, he views his past self as completely dead, and his new self, the one called Silas, had to be perfect and pure to earn acceptance and love from God and from the only person he knew. Helping Aringarosa gave Silas a purpose he never had before. Somebody was happy to have him around, someone saw his doings and was proud of him. He had a place where he didn't need to hide, and that was, despite its sober accommodation, so more comfortable than anything he had since his early childhood or ever. For the first time he had hope for the future and for himself. Silas certainly didn't wait long before becoming a monk, yearning to be a part of something and trying to please a priest. I also doubt that Aringarosa would have tried to slow him down or advised him to take his time, knowing that Silas had nothing else anyway. And so Silas immersed himself into his new beliefs without ever trying to learn anything else. All he saw from the outside world was violence and cruelty. The world rejected him, so Silas rejected it as well. His entire life now being devoted to religion without real context for it, and by that I mean that normal people who read the Bible interpret it alongside society and their personal lives, and in Silas' case he had no real vision of what a normal life is or society. He doesn't know people, and with the ardent desire to forget it all, he quickly plunged into fanaticism. Aringarosa's views were quite radical, to say the least. Starting as a simple priest, he climbed the hierarchy to become a bishop and president general of the Opus Dei in less than 10 years. Without dissecting the Opus Dei as a whole, since it's a real religious group, and all we need to care about in this essay is Silas' perspective and his mentor opinion on it. From what we learn of Aringarosa's beliefs, each member of the group has their own degree of involvement. It is not supposed to be a forced cult, and each person's engagement in the group simply has only consequences for themselves and their faith. Striving to go all the way to the end, Silas practices not only the usual strict monastic rules, but also corporal mortifications as a way to purify his soul through pain. Reading the book, it is a little confusing to understand really what the Opus Dei stands for, as many characters have sometimes contradicting opinions or informations about it, and Silas and Aringarosa don't escape this divide. It is stated that higher members of the group, like Aringarosa, don't have to submit to some of the practices commonly suggested, but even then it's very clear that even in thoughts alone, Silas and the bishop don't agree at all about what being a man of faith in the Opus Dei is about. From the start to the end of the current events, we can see Silas inflicting way more pain to himself than what even he knows as being the recommended amount. He justifies it by the actions he commits in Paris, but it's very clear that Silas finds some sort of satisfaction and anticipation for his own suffering that imply that he must have progressively increased the level of pain over the years, as he is never disturbed or perplexed by the amount of torture he inflicts on himself in such a short period of time, and even more so, his masochistic views are clearly split from the vision of his own mentor. During an interview, Aringarosa thinks to himself that those who, like that young man who nearly died from an infection after wearing the Silas for too long, were misguided sheep, and he seems so genuinely feeling bad for them. What posed the question, why is Silas so adamant about his practices when the person he looks up to the most, learned all from and lived with, is seemingly against it? First of all, let's examine Silas and Aringarosa's relationship. Silas has infinite admiration and loyalty for Aringarosa, seeing him as the person who gave him a new life and someone perfect and pure who does good all around him. But he also feels indebted to him, maybe seeing himself as a burden like he was for his own parents. Silas' intentions are not to be Aringarosa's equal, or even being close to him, but simply to see him succeed and perhaps to show him his own value, as if he wants to make sure that the bishop is assured that he was right to save him. After all, at no point in his past life do we even read about anyone else who ever cared for Silas. The bishop is not only a friend or a savior, but also the only thing that gives value to Silas' life, as he believes that in his own hands it has none. Being determined to make himself useful and worth keeping around, Silas goes as far as committing murders and contemplating killing himself when he might have put him at risk, even praying for him on his own deathbed. The bishop's feelings are less clear, as he does care for Silas and wants to have him by his side when he finally achieves his glorious plan, but it does sometimes feel like Silas is more of a pet project he was keeping around to show everyone how generous and great he is, and a reminder to himself that following the Opus Dei will turn any criminal into the perfect little soldier of God. Silas was also useful to him from doing what he's told without questions and by feeding his ego with his devotion. Most of the time when Aringarosa thinks of Silas during the present time, he thinks of him as the one that will help him gain the power he seeks, as a tool for his success. He doesn't do it in a malicious way, and he clearly did and does a lot for him as well. But knowing Silas' situation and the power dynamic between the two, his distance and lack of interest in Silas' life and thoughts while keeping him close and ready to work for him feels uncomfortable. There is a vague feeling that Aringarosa understands Silas' hopelessness and used it to his advantage while convincing himself that serving him and God is the best thing that could happen to him. Even the way he thinks about Silas being by his side when he achieves his glorious plan, Silas being almost seen as a loyal dog rather than an equal he befriended 10 years ago. Once he discovers what really happened during the events of the book, Aringarosa does feel guilty and apologize for having entangled Silas into this mess, but he seems to worry less for Silas himself than for the murders. I mean, it makes sense, right? It's quite harrowing to learn that someone you know just killed 5 people in one night, but knowing the situation and his own involvement in it, it feels a little disappointing to learn how little he seems to empathize with the man. He does good by immediately accepting to confess to the police, and it's understandable that he expects the same from Silas, but as we know, the terror he still feels after his experience in prison would have made Silas certainly end his own life rather than suffer through this again. So it seems like Aringarosa is rushing without thinking, or rather that he doesn't understand Silas and maybe simply doesn't know him as much as one would assume from their history together. Or he just doesn't care because, 5 murders. But still, it shows that they are simply not that close, they are not friends. Both of them in different chapters recall their time together in Spain, and for both of them, those memories are regarded as some of their best days. But after that, it seems that they were merely acquaintances because of their past and not because they really saw each other as close. Despite living in the same building in New York, it feels like they didn't interact as much. Certainly because Aringarosa was now a bishop and had responsibility that didn't leave room for Silas. They would bump into each other, but it almost seems like Silas was seeing him from a distance. It's just an assumption, but it is said that Silas noticed Aringarosa being depressed for weeks before Aringarosa actually told him about the news. Maybe they did talk in between and the bishop simply didn't want to bring that up for a while, and now that Silas just noticed his demeanor from a distance before Aringarosa finally takes the time to talk to him. But even in their ways of talking to each other, their relationship doesn't sound friendly. Silas always refers to Aringarosa as father or bishop, even in his own thoughts. He never calls him by his first name, nor drops the formalities. It's clear that Silas doesn't view him as an equal, something that you'd think Aringarosa would have taken the time to fix if he would have really wanted to. It is hard to understand if Silas ever told Aringarosa about his past or if he simply didn't understand him. Aringarosa knew a few key points for sure, but even for Silas' past incarceration, we only know that he found out it from the newspaper. Silas might have been secretive about his past out of shame and in order to be that new person who was not related to the ghost he once was and would have hid everything else. But it's just theories, really. The only time we see them talk about something personal related to Silas is when Aringarosa reassures him about his albinism, telling him that Noah too was albino, and tying it again to this concept of destiny Silas was chosen for and using it as a proof that Silas shouldn't be ashamed of it. And this looks like an important memory to Silas, recalling it while looking at himself in the mirror. Silas' albinism being an obvious fact, we can't use it as proof that they really discussed anything above surface level. Silas would certainly display his shame and stress of being stared at after all, and Aringarosa could have just said that in passing after noticing his behavior. And in general, most of the memories Silas seems to cherish are very banal scenes. This finite amount of memories also implies that most of their time together might have been filled with Bible studies and work. I'm not really here to study Aringarosa's personality, but he is after all the closest thing there is to Silas, so I'll give you a little piece of my mind. I think that he is in general a good person. He does care for people. He really wants to inspire them to lead better lives. Not everyone would have extended their hand to someone like Silas, and he taught him a lot, providing him with a home, giving him the opportunity to come to the US after their mission in Spain was over. Obviously, Silas spoke English very well, and he must have had a driving license, right? He does drive, so it's a little funny to imagine Silas as a monk passing his driving exam, but it does show that Aringarosa did take good care of him. But Aringarosa is also very prideful, displaying a big power hunger problem, especially in the present, his position clearly deluding him into thinking that he's the most important person in each of his scenes, even criticizing his religious superiors. He saw the Opus Dei as the only true way to be Christian, and when he learned of the papal decision to cut his group off, he felt truly humiliated, almost wanting to gain the promised power through the teacher to come back at them, more so than doing anything good for his followers. His sense of superiority made him unable to clearly think through his association with the stranger calling himself the teacher. Silas idealized his relationship with Aringarosa because it's the only one he ever had. He had nothing to compare it to. He trusted Aringarosa with his life because he never knew how much of another person's care is enough and how much he should have cared for himself. He saw Aringarosa's influence in a childish way, almost seeing him as a parent who has control over every aspect of his life, promising security and growth, and that Silas should have obeyed without question. But Aringarosa didn't have him in mind as much as Silas would have needed in that scenario. Silas is actually implied to be older than him, and Aringarosa certainly didn't feel the need to worry for him, especially if we accept the premise that he never learned of Silas' past and psychological weaknesses. If Aringarosa was truly aware of them, he would maybe have taken more precautions instructing him. And because of that, Silas was allowed to push himself toward dangerous practices and towards ideologies that would turn him into a murderer without the bishop even noticing. Despite Silas being the perfect disciple, taking his religious education very seriously, being good, polite, loving Jesus' message and his fellow new brothers, deep inside of him, Silas never changed. All he did was repressing everything seen as bad and focusing only on the dream he was promised. Silas prayed and meditated to cast away the feelings that would come back rushing. The anger, the sadness, the violence. He couldn't accept that all this effort didn't transform him into the ideal being he wanted to see himself as, and kept forcing this fake peace and happiness. And by the end of his 10 years as a member of the Opus Dei, he successfully rendered himself numb and hollow, only different from the ghost he once was by his oppressing desire for perfection. Since his earliest childhood, Silas learned to hate himself, seeing himself as others did, a ghost, a burden, a murderer. After his task of building the church with Aringarosa was done, he had once more no real purpose to strive for. After all, the life of a monk is very sober, the only goal being one's personal connection to God. But Silas didn't understand relationship, love, or communion. The only way he saw to prove his worship was his own pain. One of the key messages he learned from the Opus Dei is that pain is good. Silas believed that hurting himself as a form of punishment could free himself from his sins, from his past life, and from himself, and perhaps that's why he became so obsessed with the corporal mortification practice. It doesn't seem like he likes pain, as he complains about it a lot after he was captured, trying to accept it and use it in prayers, but still called his enemies merciful for removing his Silas and showed gratitude from being released. He repeats pain is good, as if he was trying to remind himself that he has to enjoy it, but he rather enjoys the comfortable belief that feeling pain is noble and enjoying it turns him into a better person. He had no other way to improve himself more. He already gave everything away and prayed every day. Pain is all he had left to offer. The hope that his soul would be saved and his sacrifices rewarded became his coping mechanism. After all, this was a perfect way to justify what happened to him throughout his life, to accept it. It was all a test. He suffered for something, endured everything so one day God would save him. So he happily relinquished everything else left of him. Another point about his life as a monk is the loneliness he seems to never have left. Despite not living with 100 other people, eating and going to mass all together, we never see him talk about anyone else, even mentioning any name besides bishops. Nobody will miss me, he says, acknowledging in his thoughts that after his mission he will never be able to leave his plain and empty room, condemned to hide forever. We already talked about his lack of interaction with Aringarosa, but even besides that, it seems that Silas doesn't know how to act as a friend, not simply being polite and good, but creating a bond with someone in other ways than being of use to them. Of course, to be able to have a real connection with someone, he must first allow himself to exist, something he refuses to do, carefully erasing any trace of his past and feelings. He doesn't fear people, nor does he dislike them. As he says, when awakened in panic, hearing his fellow numeraries praying out loud in the neighboring rooms always bring him peace and comfort. As soon as he enters each of the Opus Dei buildings, his thoughts go to them, being careful to not wake them up, taking the time to appreciate the kindness received from the receptionist. But he can only love them from a distance, as Silas, a character he copied from the Bible, someone he knows too well he's not. Once, Aringarosa shared the news to Silas about the Opus Dei being on the brink of no longer being accepted as an official branch of the Vatican. Is it really what happened? I don't remember. It was some weird thing about them not receiving money anymore, something stupid, I don't care. Silas was distraught, possibly mostly because it was important to Silas to feel like the Opus Dei was the only reality, and seeing it being rejected by the highest authority made it seem fake, wrong, and Silas couldn't accept it. The belief that everything he did was for something, and that he will be saved following Aringarosa in the way, was the only thing Silas had, that and obviously his adoration for Aringarosa himself, that would have made him so disappointed and furious that his friend could lose everything he spent so long to build. And perhaps Aringarosa made a big deal out of it. Him losing his influence and position in the Catholic hierarchy was so shocking that he blew the consequences out of proportions. Perhaps Silas thought that this event could cause the Opus Dei to go under and not be able to sustain their residential buildings, forcing Silas out of his sanctuary. Finally, he had found a place that accepted him, that he cherished, and once again he feared that he might lose it, doomed to the same life he so desperately wanted to forget. Silas immediately accepted Aringarosa's plan, and by the time he learned of what he must do, his only way of communication with the bishop was cut. Everything Silas did was done in 24 hours. The worst of them happened in one night. Silas had no time to think about it, no one to talk to about it. With the teacher pressuring him, telling him about a possible destruction of Christianity, cruel enemies who conspired against God for centuries. A short delay, their very last chance. Silas acted in urgency, planning for success instead of verifying the information he was given. We don't know how the first 3 killings happened. We're only told how Silas tricked Mr. Saunier and killed him without any second thought, even pleased to give him a slow and painful death. Not giving him the empathy he learned to extend to others, not seeing him as worthy of it. His belief of purging his sins with pain also influences his attacks, as he says that they paid their life of sin with their painful death. His sadistic act towards Saunier might also be a sign of jealousy. I went through all this suffering to clear my soul. You can't just die so easily to repay what you did. Leaving the scene of the crime, telling the still living Saunier, "Pain is good, monsieur." It seemed so easy to him, but we should also remember that he killed the 4 men the same night, Saunier being the last of them, making him more eager to do his task and convince himself that it was the right thing to do. As Silas says himself, once he was tasked to use violence on the teacher's behalf, everything he fought against all this time came back immediately, letting himself feel all the hate he accumulated all his life and that he denied himself to feel for the last decade. Coupled with the teacher's persuasion, feeding him a story of evildoers who have to be destroyed for the greater good, Silas allowed himself to feel aroused, it's a word they use in the book if you see what I mean, by the perspective of making a bad person pay. Removed from any external input and convinced that any sin committed in the name of God would be forgiven, Silas was led to his downfall. The teacher knew how to manipulate Silas. Not only did he have Aringarosa's total trust and cooperation, but he displayed great knowledge and faith in each of Silas' beliefs. He praised and reassured him, feeding him delusions of a holy war. It wasn't complicated to make Silas do anything he wanted. He was the only person besides Aingarosa to have ever given Silas any semblance of attention, and it being the thing that Silas truly sought, he put him on the same pedestal he did for the bishop, and was determined to make him proud. I think that Silas always wanted to be somebody in opposition to being nothing but a ghost for the majority of his life. He wanted a goal, a purpose, and a way to be recognized and appreciated. Being a monk and having nothing else in life, the idea of being a mystical warrior of God who would bring prosperity and power to the person he admired the most was like a dream to him, the only real way for him to truly exist. And now the teacher was giving him just that. We can't know for sure everything that the teacher told him, but Silas had a very strong repulsion for the 4 men he killed at the start. You can see the difference between the way Silas acts while confronting Mr. Saunier to how he acts in front of the gang later on, people he had no information on. To the first, Silas acts very smug and sadistic, taunting the man and smirking as he dies. While confronted to the others, he is cold and threatening, but he stays calm, talking without emotion. He simply does the important job he was given, nothing else. Obviously, Silas wasn't motivated by the idea of harming people, even if his deep hidden feelings helped him to do so. He harmed those he harmed because something else pushed him to do so. Certainly one of the biggest events that clearly shows Silas' view on his victims was the nun he encounters. We are clearly told that he doesn't want to hurt her, that he believes that she's innocent and shouldn't be punished for being at the wrong place at the wrong time. He acts respectfully despite lying to get the job done. He tries to act kind even when noticing her discomfort towards him. But when he made the connection between her and the men he killed, he had to change his mind. Of course, he was in a state of anger and panic after discovering that the 4 men all lied and the mission has failed. The hate in him took over immediately. He does connect the people, from the priorate to the enemy, all of them, and blame her for siding with them despite being a woman of God. I don't think that I can claim that he wouldn't have harmed her in a way or another regardless, but I have to say that Sandrine really went all in to provoke him as well. She knows exactly that Silas is deeply indoctrinated into a religious branch she already believes to be perturbed and fanatic, yet she looks at him in the eyes and insulted by name, while Silas, already crazed with hatred, threatens her with an iron candle holder. I suppose that in a desperate situation she chose to be brave rather than dying in silence, but personally I find it extremely stupid. I frankly have no idea of what would have Silas done if she would have tried to be slick and lie to get herself out of the situation. Obviously, he knew that she would have learned of the men's deaths and possibly connect them to his own presence in the church that same night, and it would have had terrible consequences for not only Silas but Aingarosa as well, since he's the one who used his influence to let Silas in the first place. But I don't know if Silas would have gone into killing an elderly nun in cold blood if he would have doubted her involvement. Maybe that's why the author had to make her provoke him into it? Even later in the story, when Silas holds Langdon at gunpoint and Remy has to reveal himself to protect the cryptex, we only see him worrying because Silas looks angry and frustrated. But from Silas' perspective, it seems like he's rather afraid that Langdon would break the keystone and certainly doesn't intend on killing him, but tries to scare him into giving it up peacefully like he was instructed. The nun was then, in my opinion, the only instance of Silas killing someone he wasn't directly asked to in the current event of the story. Plus, as he says later in his room, it was a crime of impulse. He was blinded by rage and didn't control himself. He regrets killing her, afraid of implicating Aingarosa into the murders. showing that he might have not killed her in the first place after all. So I do believe that if she would have shown a little more tact, she could have escaped that night alive. And I know that it's a little bit victim blaming, but come on, you can't tell me that it wasn't incredibly reckless and stupid of her. The only reasonable explanation I have might be that she wanted him to do it, knowing that he must have been the man who killed the 4 otters. She wanted to make sure that he won't escape from the police. Silas could have left and get onto the first plane for the US, then with a few clever lies, Angarosa could have been seen as nothing more but in contact with a man who may have been in contact with the killer. And being as involved with a lot of people and follower as he is, the connection would be so slim and impossible to prove that the police couldn't have done anything about it. I mean, from their perspective, right? We know that they would have been sold by the teacher in the end, no matter what, but you see what I mean. Silas saw the teacher's plan as a miracle to save Angarosa in the Opus Dei, something he prayed for relentlessly. He saw it as their last chance, a divine intervention he couldn't let pass. Silas was promised by the bishop that if he obeyed the teacher, who was proven himself to be smart and well prepared, they could only be victorious. Silas had the fate of everything he cared for resting on his shoulders, and suddenly it all went to dust because of him. There was no chance to achieve the plan anymore, and he messed up everything by losing his temper. So when the teacher gave him another chance, Silas didn't even think twice. Not only did he want to save Angarosa from his mistake and still make him proud in the end, but the mere thought of doom, despite all the prayers that went into this plan, was terrifying to him. Perhaps a sign that everything he believed in was nothing but hopeless dreams. In theory, the new task was way easier than anything else he had to do earlier that night, threatening a few people in a close space, taking the keystone from them without harming anyone and leaving as fast. Finally a resolution Silas wanted, but after a night of strong and painful emotions, the self-inflicted pain and fatigue, Silas was easily overpowered, underestimating the odd group, just what the teacher planned on. And once again the cycle repeats itself. Silas is at his lowest point, praying to be saved. Someone comes just in time and Silas trusts him blindly. Remy knew that it would be easy to manipulate him. He didn't even hesitate toying with him before releasing him from his bounds. I mean, he could have said something instead of coming to him with a knife and letting Silas believe that he was being stabbed. And of course, the smallest gesture of kindness, being released, being given gross vodka to wash up his dusty mouth, made Silas lower any kind of guard he had, showing gratitude instantly. And just as before, Silas was convinced that fate gave him another chance to succeed and made him jump right into action without hesitation. It feels like Silas has the opposite of trust issues, convincing himself that God will make the choices for him, that nothing bad could happen as long as Silas had faith despite knowing better. Silas might have witnessed and endured so much violence, indifference and rejection that he doesn't trust his own judgment anymore. He gives his free will away in hopes that someone else will be able to do what he couldn't. That's why he's placed his life in Angarosa's hand, then the teacher believing it being safer with them than himself. When Silas finally got the keystone, when the plan was finally achieved, he felt satisfied to have won at the end, even enjoying his revenge against the people who bound him and belittled him all night. Finally coming down from a roller coaster of emotions Silas was subjugated to, he sat in silence next to Remy, who was seemingly trying to get a reaction out of him, gloating, insulting T-Bean, trying to convince him of his role. But Silas was not reciprocating, still anxious, waiting only for one thing. Besides the final goal of straightening Angarosa's influence and securing the future of the Opus Dei, what Silas was hoping for in that moment was to meet the teacher face to face, finally being able to show his competence, being praised, seen. But the teacher wanted to see Remy, not him. But Silas' disappointment was short-lived as the teacher tells him that he needed to see him not to reward him, but to punish him for revealing his face. something Remy was instructed not to do. Immediately, Silas feels protective of him, disagreeing and worrying for the man, only accepting the teacher's order reluctantly. A huge contrast with Remy himself, who mocks Silas, knowing that he was being played with from the start. In the end, both of them hide the fate of the other, condemning both. Silas chooses to follow the teacher, knowing that Remy might die. He's been told that Remy didn't do what asked and it had to be done. Maybe it could have impacted Silas and Angarosa, or maybe Silas simply knows that disobeying could lead to that, for himself as well. Or maybe he simply values the teacher far more and still wants to please him despite disagreeing. One last time before the end, we can witness Silas' everyday life. The way he feels about that foreign Opus Dei building is almost sad. It being called refuge, asylum, as if the outside world still represents something to fear. This last decade didn't present him with a new vision of the world, he simply saw the Opus Dei as a little place separated from the rest of the world, the only place where he can be safe. He walks towards the building under the rain, still in pain but happy. He knows that the mission is over and that now he can bury those uncomfortable feelings again, the fear, the anger, the guilt. He feels lighter when discarding the gun, finally able to pretend to be the person he wanted to be, not the one people saw him as, not the one he felt forced to be in a world he saw as nothing but cruel. But here it was a different world. He thinks about the receptionist treating him normally, not even being specifically nice or interested in him, but simply not acknowledging Silas' appearance. But Silas takes the time to note his kind eyes. He felt at home again amongst people who accepted him. But all this fantasy of living in a separate world, protected from the law, was only in his head, a delusion he created for himself to be able to endure the realities of this world. And he slept for the last time. He was awakened by the same fear he tried to erase from his memories for all those years. The police was there looking for him. Without even thinking, he ran, trying to escape no matter what. Still half naked, pushing officers down, running into innocent bystanders, until he felt cornered and used a policeman's gun to shoot at the presence grabbing him by the shoulder. In that moment of terror, Silas was unable to think rationally. He wasn't thinking about talking calmly to the police, trying to outsmart them, using the gun as a threat and not firing. What he perceived behind him was an evil entity, angry hands trying to grab him. A scenario that could have only triggered old and violent defense mechanisms. But once again, the same past that destroyed his whole life came back to destroy the only person he cared for. The person was Angarosa. Silas was himself shot, but he didn't care at all. He saw the only thing that ever mattered slowly dying because of him. Without a single hesitation, he grabbed him and carried him to the nearest hospital. What is crazy, alright? Where is the police? I can't believe that they just all freaking died because Silas bodied them once. Plus the obvious other people all around who witnessed it, and the other people he would have passed by in the street. He was half naked, covered in blood, carrying a priest, also blooded, seemingly half dead in his arms, and nobody did a thing. This is maddening, but not as much as nobody at the hospital stopping Silas from leaving. What do they mean? Silas had so many injuries by that point, and he was pretty much naked, but nobody thought, while taking Angarosa away on a stretcher, to maybe tell the guy to stay? Or was Silas like no and left and nobody dared stopping him because he's huge and scary? I don't know, but it is insane. I'm so mad. I hate that world of theirs. This is stupid. But before Silas left, Angarosa woke up and told him of what happened. That they were betrayed, that everything Silas did was for nothing. That the police came for him because of that person he placed all of his trust into. Silas first thought about the situation as said to be remorse and rage. Was the remorse he felt only for Angarosa? Or for the whole situation he took part of? The rage was obvious. As they were taking Aringarosa away, Silas swore to find the teacher, even if it would take the rest of his life, and avenge Aringarosa and himself. Towards the bishop only answer, Silas, if you have learned nothing of me, please learn this. Forgiveness is God's greatest gift. Silas, you must pray. What is, I am sorry, crazy? It's such an insult. What a huge fuck is given him there. If you have learned nothing of me, this is so cruel, I can't explain this enough. Silas spent a decade worshipping this guy as a god. He then was sent by him to save him and was made to do something bad, sure, but Aringarosa doesn't even know what was said and why and how, and still, he spits in Silas' face? Like, he was so much better, he would have acted better, he knows that forgiveness is God's greatest gift. What a fucking bitch. I'm sorry about swearing and losing my cool here, but this is just disgusting, especially knowing after he learns of Silas' death, he literally only think about him for like a minute or so before thinking about himself again, and maybe the victims for a minute to be honest. But then he smiles and says, "A little faith can do wonders, Captain." A little faith? Dude, are you for real? Your trusted friend just fucking died because of his little faith that you and only you told him. This is stupid, I'm angry. Back to the hospital where nobody tried to save Silas, as he was exhausted and delirious and shot and blooded and had bondage marks and whips marks and his chin smashed and his thighs so sharply cut that way earlier his blood was already running down to his toes. All alone and hopeless again, Silas decides to simply leave and hide in the nearest park to die. Maybe Silas couldn't live knowing that he would have had to face what he did, that all his beliefs were a lie, that God didn't save him, that at the end he was even worse than before. Kneeling in the grass, he calls himself a ghost one last time, feeling himself disappearing to the mist. He simply prayed for Aringarosa and for forgiveness. As his consciousness was finally leaving him and he couldn't feel the pain anymore, he reminded himself of Aringarosa's word. Our Lord is a good and merciful God. And Silas agreed, because the pain was gone? This is such a tragic character, what can I say? This is very sad and awful and maddening, and he did a lot of very bad things. But I hope that you can see that, I mean, as a fictional character, right? Because you can take, I don't know, pain from Naruto, he killed a ton of people and people still find excuses for him, right? This is like a guy who was made to do something he wasn't even really agreeing with, but he was convinced to do it. Well, everything before that and everything after that was... I don't even know what I'm saying anymore, the text is over. I need to calm myself down so I can make a nice, I don't know, final ending, I don't know. Okay, so obviously I want to make a part 2 to this, to be able to talk about every details a little bit more and have a nice conclusion to the story and to Silas' character. But to conclude this video, all I can say is that, dude, I love this guy and I did for fucking decade. Oh my god, I love this guy. I don't care, you can say whatever you want, he's just so cute and so sad. Oh my god, and I'm saying, okay, shut the fuck up. I just wanted to talk about him a little, well, a little more than just in my lame comics, because since it's an old book kind of now, I know that he had a lot, well, he had fans back then. I remember a lot of pictures from him, right? Especially from the movies, because Paul Bettany is very nice looking, right? But not a lot of people talk about him at all. So I was like, oh, I will. So I made a deranged analysis about him, but I knew him for a very long time. I read that book when I was like in primary school still, so I had a long time to think about him because he's kind of my favorite character, don't judge me. I don't know if it's like super correct, and I made a lot of assumptions because still it's one book with a character who is not even one of the main ones. There was not a lot to go by, but I did my best because I love him. So I hope that you found some kind of, I don't know, some kind of inspiration, maybe, I don't know. That you will think about him a little bit more and maybe it will help you to understand him a little bit more. I literally have nothing else to say, like, yeah. Okay, I will make a better conclusion for the second part, okay, because my brain is dead. I just read that whole thing back to back. I'm dying. I'm not good at it. My English is not good. My brain doesn't work anymore, so I hope you liked it. And if you did, don't follow me because all my videos are trash. And the second part of this one will certainly come out in like 3 years or something, so you can just mark this page somewhere on your browser and come back in a few years to see if there is a second part. Maybe there wouldn't be, who knows, anything can happen, but thank you for listening to this video, and I really hope that it brought you something. I just love the character. Here, I'm saying it again. So have a great evening and see you another time. Bye bye.